Welcome to our 16th annual ChinaFest. I'm Rose 19 Chen. The Rose Group, the president and founder of the Rose Group for Cross-Cultural Understanding. We've been working with the University of Richmond from the very beginning. And this is our first virtual event. And I'm delighted that Professor Gengsong Gao organized a panel discussion involving some URR students. And they're going to talk about the American millennials' engagement with China. It's a very interesting and timely subject.
Okay, thank you, Rose, for your introduction to our ChinaFest and me. And first of all, let me introduce our three great panelists. Master McCooey, he is operations manager in the Ping An Cloud Accelerator. And our second panelist is Alice Wall, graduate student from the Columbia University. And our third panelist is Ifetayo Maloney. You are Global Studies major and Chinese minor. Thank you all for participating in this panel. When I read the Pew Center survey, I found something very interesting. Right now, after the outbreak of COVID-19, you see the American public has very negative views of China. But there is one exception. The younger generation, in particular people and from the age of 19 to age of 29, has comparatively favorite views of China. And it's about 20% higher favorite views of China. So this phenomenon, I think, is very interesting. So we can explore and how the millennials, young people, engage with China and perceive China in this particular moment. Okay, so first, let me pose the first question for discussion. And I want you guys to say something about, so why did you come to learn Chinese, and what drives you to keep going, keep learning Chinese?
Yeah, so I can take the start or head with this. So I started studying Chinese in high school. I was actually the first class at my high school to start studying Chinese. Before I started studying Chinese, I was studying Spanish for about 7 years, and I was taking Latin also at the same time. So Chinese was kind of a second thought of mine until I completely fell in love with the language. So what got me started was the opportunity to actually start studying Chinese, and taking that opportunity and taking that first step and then just falling in love with the language instead of taking French or Spanish, which was very common and something that I heard everyone took. So I was very happy that this other opportunity arose. And then once I got to senior year of high school, I was taking AP Chinese. And then once I joined at University of Richmond, I started taking Chinese again and kept on taking it, kept on falling in love with it more and more. And I think that was a lot to do with the teaching staff at University of Richmond, the study abroad opportunities, and also just to take different classes as well. Instead of just only Chinese language courses, you take multiple spectrum courses at University of Richmond for your Chinese studies majors and minors. So I took Middle Eastern philosophy because I was also doing PPEL, and I also took history of Asia, history of modern Asia, which was extremely interesting to me. So it just kept on building and building and building into such a love for Chinese and Asian culture in general. And then my study abroad experience was what made me really start to really love China, because after I went there once, after I'd been to China, after I was able to speak the language much more fluidly, I think that just kind of brought me into a whole different mindset, a whole different way of thinking about China, thinking that I can go over there whenever, and after working over there, it's just opened up so many different doors for me to then expand on this idea and love for the Chinese language and Chinese culture.
Thank you, Monsieur. And next, I think could you say something?
Yeah. So Matthew really touched on a lot of points, but similar, I started taking Chinese in 7th grade because my 7th and 8th grade experience was immersed with my high school experience. So the program was in my high school. And my high school had made the decision to only teach Arabic and Chinese. So it was really a decision between the two of those. And their reasoning behind that is that they saw that Chinese and Arabic were becoming the more global languages as the years went on, which I totally see now, and I totally agree with it. And I chose Chinese instead of Arabic because all my friends that took Arabic were struggling, and they were like, "You should take Chinese instead." And I was like, "Okay, I'll take Chinese." And I'm not gonna say it's easier than Arabic, but it's the only language that I guess has stuck. Like I've tried Spanish, and conjugating verbs has just not, it just didn't work in my brain. And so Chinese is the only thing that has been clicking. And yeah, so I've stayed with Chinese. I'm currently a junior right now at the university, and I'm still in Chinese. Next semester I'll be in 302 with Gao, which I'm really excited for. And what drives me to keep going is just my career goal in life is to work for the U.S. government in any aspect, translator or, like as a foreign service worker. Like that's really my goal right now. And I know that having a language and being fluent as much as possible would really help me get my foot into the door with that.
Okay, I guess this is my turn. So I come from a very strong Chinese Vietnamese background. Both my parents are Vietnamese nationals, but my mom is she's ethnically Chinese, and for most of my life I grew up speaking Cantonese. When I was younger, as elementary school student, I used to actually take Chinese on the weekends, but I think I wasn't taking it as seriously as I should have as a kid. It was not necessarily that because I didn't care for Chinese, it's just that I was very overwhelmed having to do schoolwork in English on the weekdays and having to learn Chinese on the weekend. It was an extra workload for me. And my parents they knew how to speak Chinese, but they couldn't read or write it. So that presented as a obstacle in learning Chinese for me, because I couldn't ask questions like, okay, how come it's phrased a certain way? How do you write a certain word? Because they just didn't know how to write it. And in high school, my high school actually offered Mandarin as an option, and I wanted to take Mandarin, but because it was we only had one Mandarin teacher and a lot of people were interested in Mandarin, I wasn't able to take Chinese. And then when I went to Richmond, I realized Chinese was offered here, so I decided I wanted to take Chinese. And I continued, after the 2-year requirement was over, I continued to take Chinese because I realized it made my Cantonese better. In terms of being able to understand actually be able to start speaking correct grammar, not just talking on the street level Cantonese. So it was really helpful, and I realized learning Mandarin Chinese was able to kind of help me connect more to the Chinese culture side of my life. So that's what really kept me going. And I also noticed that as I continue on to through my career path working in social work, I've actually kind of been drawn to Chinese speaking populations the most, especially the immigrant population. So that's what's been keeping me, continue to practice my Mandarin, continue to practice my Cantonese, and trying to make sure I retain these languages. And on a personal level, being Chinese is something I really care about. It's really it's really entangled with my identity, and that's a part of my identity I really want to keep. So I do try to keep learning and maintaining my language skills.
Okay, great. And you guys just came to learn Chinese and for different reasons, but I feel that most of you start quite early on, right? So I know every one of you have been to China, right? And according to some empirical research, and if the people have been to the country, okay, and then she may tend to have a more favorable views of the country. So if they have the first hand experience there. So I was just wondering, okay, so how did your travel and the study abroad experience in China affect your perception of perception of Chinese people or Chinese culture and language. Okay, so you don't have to just tell the positive stuff. You can also say something about how the first-hand experience in China change your perception of China in a negative way. Okay, either positive or negative, right? Fine. Okay, so just tell our audience, okay, your first-hand experience, how they changed or improved or gain a better understanding of China. So who would like to say first?
Yeah, I guess we just figured out an order. So yeah, my study abroad definitely changed my perception of China a lot. I had never been before, but my dad had been traveling to China for multiple years. And so he would always tell me stories about China, tell me, you know, this, that, and the other, about the food, about the people. So I'd been hearing stories forever. But, you know, I'd never really been there. And also, Gao can probably tell you that I was never really the best speaker of Chinese most of the times in all of our classes. So going over there really expanded my speaking ability for Chinese overall, which was great. And then just meeting people over there was completely opposite to everything I had been told growing up, like, you know, China being scary or people not being as nice or people not really liking foreigners over there. So it was really interesting to see the exact opposite be the truth. So seeing all the people being extremely nice, welcoming, and, you know, friendly towards foreigners, getting my language skills up, and also experiencing like the food and cultural aspects as well. Going to Peking University, like we saw a lot of the cultural aspects. I thought that really opened my eyes up to China and really helped me to, you know, pursue my passion and to continue with Chinese and to stay there after I graduated and to start working there.
Okay, thank you, Matthew.
I guess my study abroad experience differs between Matthew and Alice only because I had the opportunity to study abroad my junior year of high school, and I was in Nanjing. And like I was only a junior in high school, so I guess I really I hope to have gotten another study abroad experience, but due to COVID, I couldn't go, or I can't go next semester. But even still, like Matthew said, like just actually having the firsthand experience with the people and the culture. I actually had a host family, so that was very different from like being on a college campus. My host family, they're so great, and to this day, like I still keep in contact with them. The food, it's so unmatched. American cuisine will never top like authentic Chinese food, and I miss that so much from just like the 1 month that I was there. But I would have hoped to gotten that study abroad experience in college, only for the language aspect to like really strengthen my language. But I do plan on going abroad maybe after graduation to really have that experience, because I feel like out of everything with being in the Chinese department, I feel like this, like lacking that study abroad experience really hinders my language right now. But I'm confident that once I get that experience, like my language will become better.
Okay. And Alice, I know you have some negative experience in China right now. So you can just tell us the truth, okay? So you don't have to praise China, okay? So this is a panel for our audience to have better understanding of China, okay?
Well, like I grew up, I'm a first gen, so this is like studying abroad was a major milestone for me because my family has never let me travel even a couple blocks from my apartment without having like someone like call me, someone follow me. Like it's just, for me, like going abroad was a really big step, and I enjoyed, like I feel like even though like I did have some negative experience, I did enjoy being in China because being Asian American, it's like it's nice to have everyone look like you when you walk down the street. You don't stick out, and that's really nice. It kind of relaxing. Like I felt like I could be a place and no one really was paying attention to me, and I kind of enjoyed that. Culturally, it's very interesting because I think my family has history with Southern China, so like, you know, being in the north, like the accent was very interesting. Because especially when I'm traveling on a taxi and like the taxi driver is like speaking with that very thick northern accent, and he's like yelling at me. He's like, "Where do you want to go?" And I'm like, can you repeat that? Like, so being, and but because I'm also Asian American, there is a perception that I am Chinese. So that has given me some confrontation in terms of like, not bad, but like they've definitely been kind of like, if I couldn't respond in proper Chinese, they kind of just like, who are you? Like, why, what's wrong with you? And then I would be like, oh, I'm a foreigner. And they're like, oh, then they're nicer, but definitely have that kind of awkward tension at times. I think one thing that I was like, now that I'm reflecting on the experience like 2 years afterwards, it's kind of mental health, and like the idea of like how do you deal with, you know, loneliness abroad there was very interesting. Because I did have some trouble, like, you know, feeling lonely, feeling kind of the culture clash. And I went to the department that I was working with, the history department, and I was telling them like, I know I'm just feeling a little bit overwhelmed being here, like I'm alone here, and I'm not necessarily getting along with people in the program because there's expectation that I already fit in with the native population. And they kind of just told me like, oh, you should just talk to your friends. And I was like, what friends? Like, all my friends are in the US. Like, I don't have any friends here. But I think it's kind of the idea of like mental health is very like the individual or like the family oriented. Like you work with either your family, your friends. It's not like you go see a medical professional there necessarily. So that was something interesting that I found that's very different from like, you know, Richmond or even the United States, where you like when I see a mental health professional, it's like easier. It's like if you have health insurance, it's pretty easy to get like a referral to a mental health professional. But like in China, I don't think there's really like a cultural norm for that exactly. So that was the one experience I found that's very interesting. And I know for Dr. Gao's class, we talked about like the self-help culture, like how there's a big prevalence of self-help books in China and like the Chinese like literary. So I think now after going there, I was like, it makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways, like cultivating yourself instead of seeking help from outside resources.
Yeah, I agree with you. When I was in college, I also had this kind of depression, and I just depends upon myself to solve this problem. So when I came here, I found, okay, American university has a very professional way, right, and expert to help students to get
kind of along what Al said as well. When I was studying in China, the first couple days were definitely the hardest because I did a full immersion program there. So I signed a contract that I wouldn't speak English from Monday to Friday. And I had 2 quizzes a day, 2 tests a week, about 9 hours of class, like time in a basement. And, you know, I did really badly on a oral speaking quiz one day. And I just found myself sitting outside the classroom crying, like, and the teachers were like, oh, what is this kid doing? So like they kind of didn't really look at me and be like, oh, like, you know, are you okay? Like, it's okay. Like, you know, a lot of the teachers at University of Richmond would do. But like, thankfully I had friends in the program and they cheered me up, but like, it was a completely different experience from like what you would see at UR. Cause like if a teacher or a professor at University of Richmond sees you outside of the classroom or something, just like crying after a test, like, they're going to take you inside their office, talk you through it, like offer tutoring sessions, things like that. But like the main thing that they're trying to get me to kind of realize that I had to power through it myself. And I did. I ended up doing very well. But like that was kind of what they were trying to instill in me, that I had to power through this myself. And, you know, it worked. It worked. So.
Yeah, you know, in China, every class has much more students than American class, and the teacher do not have the time and resources to help every single student. But if we see this in a positive light, as Matthew mentioned, right, and the also way, right, to develop student ability to, right, to solve the problem alone, right, instead of asking for others' help. Okay, so we just mentioned that right now a majority of American people have a very negative perception of China, and so I was just wondering, okay, so are there any difference in the perception of China in different ethnic communities or backgrounds? So the 3 panelists, I think you can say something about your ethnic groups general perception of China, and could you tell us, is there any difference between your ethnic group perception of China and the mainstream view of China?
Yeah, so obviously I'm white. I think that the general view of my ethnic group in America is kind of, you know, they're very much very powerful, a very powerful nation, both economically and just their global reach for the creation of products, the production factories, and also economically, and the startups that are coming out of there, such as Huawei, Tencent, Alibaba, that grow into these gigantic, huge companies. So I think that a lot of the perception comes economically from my ethnic group. But I feel like a lot of times as well, my ethnic group is very closed off to hearing about, cultural aspects of China and, anything besides like the economic way that they're kind of going about it. They're more just business oriented towards it. And I think that differs from the main perception view of China because, I feel like a lot of people in, the mainstream, they kind of perceive China in a more culturally diverse way of thinking about it, such as, martial arts or the history of China or, dragons or things like that have more semblance of meaning and history behind them instead of just, thinking of things economically or, that they're trying to take over the world or something like that in more recent times. But I think that, that kind of differs from, more of a more generalized overview of China, which is, I think, what the mainstream perception of it is, instead of just like them just picking up on one thing or even, doing a deep dive into China. The mainstream perception is just a general gloss over of a lot of Chinese different cultural and historic symbols that they might not even fully understand.
Thank you.
Wow, Matthew, you just touched on so much, but so I'm African American, and there's a lot that I forgot to touch on about my study abroad experience being Black in China, but so I guess I'll just say, like, when I first went to China, I was very unaware of how different I was compared to, just like, it really made me realize like how homogenous like China is and how just like looking different, being a different skin tone really like makes you stand out in the crowd. And yes, I experienced a lot of like, looks and stares and pictures and things like that. But it didn't make me like, I didn't see it as a bad thing. I just started to learn it as just like, Chinese people are just very curious. They're like, I'm very different because like it's not a lot of Black people in China basically. And so when you are one of few people that they do see that looks different, it's just curiosity that really piques their interest and they just want to learn. But at the minute I spoke Chinese, they were just, oh my God, you speak Chinese. They wanted to be my best friend. They wanted to add me on WeChat, like it's just things like that I really was not prepared for, but it made the experience worthwhile. Like no complaints about that. And how does my ethnic group like view China? Similar to what Matthew said, it's a very like business oriented thought. Like it's just like, okay, economically, like we know that China is continuing to grow. And so we just see them as like hard workers who are just like, just trying to become more advanced economically. But is it different from the mainstream perception? I guess for my ethnic group, I'll just say that we can be very ignorant sometimes, and we just tend to just group Chinese as all of like Asian, or we're just like very quick to assume one's nationality, which is not okay in any way. But that's to say, like as soon like once we see that the person is Chinese or we learn that they're of Chinese descent, then we just tend to just think of the main common things like dragons and the color red and, those historical things that are very sentimental to like Chinese culture.
Alice.
Well, I mentioned earlier I'm half Chinese and like half Vietnamese. My father's side of the family is Vietnamese, and in terms of my mother's side of the family, we're pretty removed, like generationally, from China. The last generation in China was my grandmother, and she left in the 1930s to avoid the Japanese invasion. And so it's pretty removed. And in terms of China, it's like conflicting as a Vietnamese Chinese trying to come to terms with it, because Vietnam is not in great kind of relations with China right now, especially with the conflict over the South China Sea, I believe, in terms of like there's been issues there in terms of the Chinese government also like taking over parts of of Vietnam, or like not necessarily like through like force, but like through economic means. So you're seeing kind of the way like China is expanding and like controlling resources through economics by funding. And a lot of like maybe not the government themselves feel any negative way towards this, but a lot of the local people, especially in the South, have a very kind of mixed views towards China, especially with the feeling that the Chinese are kind of taking control of their territory. And this is coming from a country that has historically been taken over by the French, by the US during the Vietnam War. So there's a lot of kind of fear regarding like, you know, China's encroaching power in the South China Sea area. So I can't speak for all Vietnamese, but I know my dad does not like China, and he talks to a lot of people back home, and they definitely have a lot of concerns over the growing economic power of the country. But I also noticed that as a Chinese person, there's this, as Matthew brought up, this kind of feeling that China is both advancing into the future, but also stuck in the past. There's an almost idea of like you're nostalgic for that kind of ancient Chinese like aesthetic of the dragons, the king, the empress, the concubines, and all that stuff. But then you're forgetting that China has the boat train. Like, you know, like having that too, like the future and the past both combined in this country. And I think sometimes like Chinese Americans or even Chinese people don't really know which part of which timeline they're trying to grapple with. Are they reminiscing of the China of the past? Or are they proud of the China of the future? I know my grandmother, when I asked her, I asked her, I was like, how do you feel about China? She was like, Mao Zedong. Like, she was like, he gave us, like, he united the country. He, like, kicked out all the foreigners. And I was like, do you actually know his policies? Like, because she didn't grow up in China. She lived in Vietnam for most of her life. So she didn't, like, you know, live through the, like, Cultural Revolution or the Great Famine or anything. And then she was just like, Mao Zedong. Like, she just, like, was very happy about it. And she's very nostalgic about the past, but she doesn't really talk much about the future or the present. And also, like, even in 2018, when I said I was going to China, my mom was very like, why China? Like, what's there? And I was like, there's a lot there. Like, there's cities there. Like, it's not like the village or the huts or anything you're imagining in your mind, but she's still very attached to that image. So I think there's a very conflicting image of China in general. It's like the past, the future, the present. And they're trying to, like, even China, I think, is trying to blend all of that together. Especially, like, how do you keep, like certain aspect of the past that's very representative of the Chinese identity, but while moving forward also to the future.
Yes, as you mentioned that because of your ethnic background, have some kinds of special connections with China, right? There's kind of the cultural and the historical baggage over there, right? That influenced the diaspora, right? Chinese diaspora's perception of China. So let's move from the ethnic group's perception of China to more of your personal perception of China. So after the outbreak of COVID-19, so right now, you know, I think China did a pretty good job in handling the COVID-19, right, the United States. But this virus also just makes the American people perception of China worse, right? So I was just wondering how the COVID-19 influenced your understanding of your perception of China.
So I actually lived in China when the COVID-19 outbreak was going on. I fortunately got out right as it was getting very big in China for Chinese New Year. But so I kind of have a skewed perception because the outbreak forced me to resign from my job in China. It forced me to, you know, start living in the United States again. I couldn't get back into China. So I think that it definitely has kind of a tinge to it that I don't like it as much because they did such a good job. It's a problem. The reason why I don't like it is not because of any other reason besides that China was trying to do so well and trying to keep this virus under control to such a point where I couldn't go back to China. Most foreigners couldn't go back to China. And, you know, I completely understand why, because of how bad the United States has been handling it currently. I understand why, and I think that they did a very good job of containing it. And I think that, you know, it hasn't changed any of my love for China or my perceptions of China overall. I still want to go back there once this pandemic is over, and I want to work there, find work there again. I think that, you know, some of the things by our standards in the United States were a little bit extreme. Like some of the videos that I saw of people being, you know, pulled out of cars if they denied a COVID test. But at the same time, again, we're seeing how bad it can be in the United States. This is what happens in a country when it's left unfiltered, or, you know, no real precautions are put in place. And so I think that, you know, China did it in a very forceful yet effective way. And I don't think a pandemic should tinge my thoughts on a country at all that I love and study. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with Matthew. Like, I feel like China, out of like all nations, like China was one of the best countries to, like Matthew said, forcibly yet effectively, you know, prevent the spread of COVID-19. And like, yes, I did see those videos as well, where like some people were like pushed into their house, but I feel like that was much needed. Like, if we compare where we are in for America, reaching like thousands of deaths a day, like compared to China, who I think, like, didn't they have lockdown for maybe 3 months, and then it started to open up? We're reaching like almost a year of being in quarantine lockdown. And so it just really goes to show, and I feel like as Americans, like, we just have to give credit where credit is due, and say that China did what was needed to do to ensure that all of their citizens were safe and or at least comfortable living, and being just like comfortable and confident in their government and in their nation. But I also will say that this may just be like American, just like television or media, but it really portrayed China as just like not really like falsifying some information. And it really raised a lot of eyebrows, especially when it came to like specific doctors and scientists who like first found COVID, and now like they're just up and just disappeared. Like, that really raises some eyebrows towards like what's going on in China. But that doesn't change my perception of just like how good they've been able to like handle the virus.
Well, for me, like, I feel like there's no way for this question to not have a hot take of any sort. Like, I feel like whatever you say, someone's going to disagree with you with this question about how like COVID changed your view about China. And for me, my colleagues have mentioned, like, you have to give credit where credit was due in terms of how they were able to kind of establish like contact tracing, like, you know, able to kind of like make sure like containing the virus, even if it meant like shutting down entire cities to do it. And like, while I understand there are definitely some people who like, you know, would question like the human rights aspect of those actions, but like, again, if you compare to countries like that prize individualism and individual rights, like the United States, we're having people who are outright calling COVID-19 a hoax. I'm living in New York, and there's like, it's starting to peak, like hit like below the virus cases again. So like, it's very frustrating to see like how precautions are being flaunted here just because things seem to like become a new normal of some sort. But other countries, especially in Asia, are doing much better with the pandemic. And I definitely like Ifei mentioned, like, I definitely had I raised an eyebrow with the doctor's death in China, especially with all the outcry on social media. And like, I know that so much we're seeing might not necessarily be shown either because of the way the government filters the kind of the internet search. So I don't know how much I can comment about how like what news are coming out of China, because I know that the government does play a role in filtering and censoring certain news, especially if they're not positive. But I do like to comment about the fact that like, it's very interesting to see how like the local government, like especially I think the doctor's death was about how the local government wanted to keep things secret, and then and then the federal government the national government stepped in, and it just shows that there has to be some sort of like some sort of thing that's going behind the scenes in terms of like the system that's working behind the scenes that like why isn't there more openness to talk about this stuff? So I definitely, like, that's the one thing I was concerned about, was like, why wasn't there more openness to talk about this stuff? But then you also could compare to the United States, where we had a doctor, a female doctor, who had police storm into her house in Florida with guns pointed at her children. So I think like it's also one of those things where people, when they see China, they think, oh, it's so different, it's so far away. But I'm like, it's not that different. It's like, you know, it's like two sides of the same coin in some ways. Like there's like we have people here, we have professionals here being guns pointed at them, or being told to like hide COVID numbers here in the United States. And you're also seeing that, like, whether you believe there's a conspiracy about like COVID numbers there or not, but you do see like similarities. So I think like one thing that's changed is that I've seen more similarities between the two countries, both positive and negative similarities. And I think that's a good thing, because it shows that things are not as different as, or like far as we think they are, and that there's a lot more similarities and differences between the two nations.
Yes, and most scholars say that right now it's a moment for the Western democracy to think about the relative strength of the authoritarian government and the particular moments of the public health, right? But this is a scholar's perspective, but we know that the Trump administration, right, puts all the blame upon China, and his blame shifting seemed to work well, right? The American people right now, after the outbreak of COVID-19, have a worse and worse perception of China. So I was just wondering, okay, so to some extent, you are expert on China. So let me ask you this question. So if we want to improve this kinds of U.S.-China relations, so where can we start from?
I think that the place that we can start from as panelists and people overall is talking to our friends and talking to people who we think that aren't as well versed and aren't as well accustomed to China or haven't studied as much as us. I think that more of a grounds up like type of thing, not grassroots, but kind of ground up from like our perspective, from our inner circles, trying to spread it to them, then to people farther out, and then more information will just become more and more disseminated as we start to tell people. But obviously there's the responsibility of the higher ups in our country as well, in politics and legislation, to, instead of spreading fear and misinformation about China and demonizing China, I think that it really falls on them a lot of times, as the public views them as some of the highest people in the land. So, and the media spotlight is very often on them. So we can try all that we want, but I think that very often the brunt of the work does fall on the larger people in our society, or not the larger, but the more, media spotlighted people in our society.
Yeah, I agree with Matthew. I really feel like education is like the fundamentals of just like how we can better our relationship. Yeah, because if I didn't take a chance and start taking Chinese, then I wouldn't have gotten this positive, mindset towards China, towards the culture, towards the language. And I feel like that, like I said, a lot of people in my ethnic group, or just a lot of Americans in general, are very ignorant of how Chinese people actually like how China operates. And like going back to what Matthew said, like the media as well. In my global studies class, like we had a project where we looked at different countries from other sources from other countries. So like, for example, I was looking at Hong Kong protests, but not through the Americans like news. I was looking at it from Taiwan. I was looking at it from all different avenues. And doing that really showed me how American news is so quick to switch the story and really, like Matthew said, demonize like China. And that's the problem, is that we're only reading what we can access. But if we just take a step back and try to go from other avenues, we'll really see the truth. And that's what we need right now to really strengthen our relations, is just being honest, like putting the truth out there. As much as it is negative, like that's important, because we can always look for, look for improvement in the future. And that goes for both countries.
Kind of echoing Ifei, like about education. I think one of the biggest issue between U.S. and Chinese relation is the ideologies. Like, some people, they hear communism and then they shut down. They immediately shut the door to any open conversation. And that's because, like, I want to say, like, our public schools, especially, like, unlike a lot of private schools, like, public schools are very formulated in terms of, like, they teach a curriculum that's very strict in order to, like, fulfill, like, an AP test or something. Like, it's very strict and narrow curriculum that doesn't always encourage, like, I would say, personal thinking or thinking about thinking about something in a different perspective. There's a lot about memorization, like memorizing facts and deep, like, and history, but not a lot of, like, encouraging thought from, like, their students. And I think that's a big issue because we're taught, like, communism is equated to bad, but, like, we're learning this from the United States perspective, a country that has no history with communism or as a political practice. And that's I think that's already a lot of reasons why a lot of Americans shut the door from even talking about China, because they automatically assume that anything associated with communism is bad. So that's one thing I think is a big kind of like the obstacle in U.S.-China relations, is that there's no open-mindedness because both countries hold on to very strong political values that are very fundamental to the founding of their nations. And I think I understand and respect that. I think there's a need to also be open-mindedness when it comes to communicating and approaching each other in order for some real conversation to happen. So I think that's like one place we have to start. It's like, how do we kind of dissolve some of that ideological tension? Is it through, like, like public schools, like public school? A lot of Americans go to public school or have been to some form of public school. So is that where we will start with teaching, like, children to be open minded to different cultures and different practices, or like, how would I can't really think of schools, because that's where most states require people to go to school until they're 16. Afterwards, whatever they do is up to them. So I can't even say college campuses, because it's a privilege to even be a college student, to go to college full time. So I really say, like, we have to start from, like, the basics, the fundamentals, and that's the only reason way could, like, really open the door to, like, conversation between the two nations. Because I think right now it's like a little bit like a Cold War at the moment. Like, both sides are kind of, like, don't really want to listen to each other, because they're saying, like, oh yeah, like, we've seen how, like, one side saying, like, communism is bad, the other side saying, like, oh, like, look at your COVID numbers. Like, I don't see that happening in communist countries. Like, it's, like, very baffling in that sense.
I think that also goes to, like, another huge point with our education, and also, like, just people's perspectives overall. Like, China is not communist, like, by any standard of the word communism. Like, China is not a communist nation. Like, I worked in the private sector in China. Like, China has one of the largest private sectors in the entire world. Like, China has never been and will never be a communist nation. Just because the Chinese Communist Party is the party that's in control does not make it a communist nation. And I think that also it just creates so much more divide in the United States by just calling China communist. It ends so many conversations with Republicans, because they're just like, oh, like, China's communist. And, like, they make that as such a huge talking point. Like, oh, China, like, communist China. Like, okay, obviously you don't understand what communism is. So I think that's also a huge thing that has to just be completely thrown out of most rhetorics and taught, or just more, or explained better in either education or in the mainstream media or in the mainstream thought processes.
Overall, I just think that both countries just really need to humble themselves. We have two superpowers trying to, like, fight, like, really one up each other. And it's really the fact that, like I said, like, we just have to acknowledge, like, we don't know what we're doing all the time. And, like, both of these countries are really saying, like, I know what I'm doing, like what Alice said, based on, like, old ideology that worked in the past. But we have to see, like, as we move for the future, those same ideologies are going to need some tweaking to really work for all of society. And that's what both the US and China is failing to do, is just, like, really think outwards for everyone's sake. and humble themselves to actually get to the table and like start making those conversations and start building the relationship that we need for all of the world.
I also think like there needs to be a need to like stop looking at China as just a business oriented country. Like, you know, we see like a lot of Americans look to Europe as the place of arts and culture and like all that, like, you know, drawing their lineage, obviously for good reason. There's a reason why they draw so much, like there's a lot of like, you know, focus on European like aesthetics and European kind of like the way Europe has influenced America, but there's not from a more cultural perspective, but they kind of focus on China as a very economic sphere. Like it's always about money, how much China is spent like investing in Africa, how much money China is investing in this sector, competing on an economic business front. But I think that's like, that creates a nature of competition. Like Ifei mentioned, it's not about like being friends. It's about like, can I make more money than you? Can I keep my citizens more than you? Like, how am I better than you? And I'm like, no, this is not the way to go.
Yes, and I agree with you that right now when the Western world talk about China and too much focus is on China's economy, right, or the military power, right? So I think this can connect us to the next question. We can talk about the culture aspect, okay? In particular, the pop culture thing, right? So I was just wondering, what do you know about American millennials' reception of Chinese pop culture and the Chinese millennials' reception of American pop culture?
So for American millennials' reception of Chinese pop culture, I would say it's a lot less well received in America than American millennial pop culture is received in China. So something that just recently happened to me was one of my friends was setting up Alipay, which is very, very big over in China. And I didn't think that most Americans knew about it, but he wanted to get stuff shipped from China. So he is setting up an Alipay. And so I think it's starting to get more and more around to being accepted over here and starting to become a little bit more normalized or mainstream. But most of the things that are mainstream over here are very mainstream in China. Like all you see people wearing in, you know, downtown Shenzhen or Beijing is like Off-White, Supreme, Yeezys, like all this like streetwear from the United States. They're all listening to like Kanye West, Taylor Swift, like American artists for pop culture, for like pop music types of things. They love talking to Americans about that as well. So I think it's adopted in China. American culture is adopted in China a lot more than Chinese culture for things that's adopted in America. But I think that also at the same time, things such as TikTok have kind of exposed a lot of Chinese culture, like a lot of Chinese like streetwear. Like I see TikToks on about Chinese streetwear that isn't like, you know, Yeezys and Supreme and stuff on TikTok, on my American TikTok all the time. So I think that, and they have like millions of American likes. And I'm just like, okay, well, like obviously people think that this is really interesting and really cool, like from the younger generation. So I think that, you know, it's starting to be more and more normalized over here to think of the millennial pop culture in China actually having its own very distinct and unique and cool identity.
Yeah, I really don't have much to say, only because I'm not very confident in like Chinese millennials' perception of American pop culture. But as far as like American millennials' perception of Chinese pop culture, like you said, TikTok has become popular over here. I will say that I personally was very hesitant to get onto TikTok, just due to it being like one of the apps that was like sponsored by like Chinese government and just like privacy reasons and things like that, to the point like I was very iffy about the whole situation. And then like when it became like a whole like potentially a lawsuit against TikTok, I was even more scared, because like for it to get to that level really made me feel pretty confident that like the Chinese government was very much in like phone data and things like that. So I was I really didn't want to get it, but TikTok is very addictive, and here we are now. Yeah, I will say that a lot of Americans are jumping onto that wave, jumping onto like some like fashion trends as well. I know a couple like women now are starting, or like, like a lot of women are starting to like wear styles that like resemble like styles back in China and things like that. So
I don't know if I'm considered a Chinese millennial or am I considered an American millennial. But as a member of the Chinese diaspora community, I think like I think it's like a very general like love for Chinese pop culture, because like they invest so much money in the Chinese pop culture there. Like there's so much investment going into their dramas, going into the movies, going into culture there. It's just like the quality is amazing. Like you say what you want, but the quality compared to like, because I grew up on TVB, like Hong Kong dramas, like the quality is so much better. Like amazing, like 10 out of 10. So I would say like there's like, as a Chinese diaspora millennial, a lot of people I know who are Chinese diaspora who identify strongly with that identity really do enjoy like the pop culture that's coming out from China, because it's just very high quality. In terms of American millennial, from what I've noticed, a lot of gaming. It's been the one thing a lot, like how China's been entering like the American millennial market. Like I know Matthew mentioned how like, American pop culture is very prevalent there, but I think China's pop culture is becoming very prevalent in terms of the, online gaming Olympics, online gaming competitions. Like I know like, for example, like there's a lot of apps like from Tencent that's getting really popular in like the US App Store, even though it's like a Chinese like company, but it's just like usually like there's just a lot of like details and a lot of money that goes into producing these games that a lot of Americans are very hooked on it. So I think that's one thing I see like in terms of reception. In terms of like other aspects of pop culture, like I mean Mulan just came out, and like like it's like, what does it say? The fact that like another movie that came out that starred like an all Chinese Asian cast is a movie about like a ancient Chinese like legend. Like it's like interesting to see how like there's a very tight clinging to that like that aspect of Chinese culture, like the honor, Confucianism, like the kind of fighting, the martial arts. Like they're still very drawn. Like American public is still very drawn to that, even though like granted a lot of people do not like Mulan because they didn't like the adaptation of the old the cartoon Mulan. But like you have to say like it was very like people were excited at first because of those aspects of Chinese culture that's being invested in, like that's being shown on TV. Like the other like Chinese TV movie that came out was Crazy Rich Asians.
I was gonna talk about.
And even then, it's, I mean, it's not in China, but it's like it's still portraying a certain aspect of like stereotypes about Chinese internationals, like the rich Chinese internationals. So there's still like certain aspect of Chinese there's just like certain aspects of Chinese culture that are still, I think to an extent, still very stereotypical that's being produced in like the American like mainstream pop culture.
Okay, thank you. And we have 4 questions left for discussion. So let's do it in this way, okay? From number 7 to number 9, okay? So each of you just pick, okay, one question from number 7 to number 9. And for the last question, and you just use one sentence, okay, to make a brief prediction of the future US-China relations, okay?
Sorry, I'll pick 8.
Okay, you pick 8, okay. Is political criticism possible in China?
Yes. So this is something that I personally experienced when I was in China. I had a friend who was Chinese visiting because he worked in New York, and he was visiting me in Shenzhen. And me and him just went out to dinner, and we're just talking, regularly in the street, in the restaurant, talking about a lot of things that were going on in China, such as the Uyghur situation, Xi Jinping with his recent, rise to lifetime power, criticisms just of the government overall about bannings on WeChat, about bannings on Weibo, about multiple different things overall. And no one gave us a second look. No one cared. Our waiters didn't, try and tune in our conversations. So I think that political criticism is definitely allowed in China in a more localized area, kind of, person to person. But once you make it a public thing in China, it just becomes a completely different issue. So I think that, something that I would like is for China to more open up their political criticisms, but I understand that they would rather have it be more of a unified and justly a unified people under one flag. I understand that, but I think that, political criticism is an important part of political discourse and an important part of, people growing and learning about different things in their culture.
Yes, and I agree that this kind of very open and explicit, right, criticisms, in particular of the Xi Jinping, right, the top Communist Party leaders, is impossible in China, right? But more localized, right, this kind of private conversations, right, and criticism is still possible, right, in China. And next.
I guess I'll go ahead and still talk about only from so political criticism. Speaking specifically in the past, I took a course with Gao about Chinese literature, and it's just fascinating how in literature so many authors were so confident to write about their feelings or just true authentic feelings towards the Chinese government. And so reading those books, like I said, this was in the past, so during Mao's era and things like that, that's what the books we were reading. Even the discourse that you could see from the storylines of just how authors felt about the government and also how they were treated after the book was published is really interesting to see. And I feel like a lot of authors are starting to do that. And it'll still happen and it'll still be very apparent in China. And so aside of just local conversations, I feel in books and in education, that'll start to become more normalized, is that political, discourse.
I kind of want to talk about 9, but I don't know if I know enough to give a proper answer to that, because I feel like that's a dissertation on its own if I try to answer that. But I definitely think there's a lot of cultural differences in different regions of China, especially not just the dialect, the language or anything, but I think also for example, one of the aspects of the study abroad program that I went to at Peking University was that we had a study trip. So we traveled from Beijing to other parts of China. We went to Sichuan, we went to Yunnan province, and then in Yunnan province, there's a lot more greater deal of conservation practices in terms of environmentalism, I think, because they have they really try to keep the waterways very clean there, because it's kind of part of the local practice that from the past has carried down. And also I think we were also talking about how the further you got from these major metropolitan areas, the kind of the less influence of maybe the national government or even the historical influence. I think I was talking to somebody at the school, was saying how and these provinces further from Beijing, there was less of an influence of the Cultural Revolution there. So there's still a very big historical they're still very focused on how their history has shaped the culture there. So I definitely think there's a lot of cultural difference in China. I think if you've just been to 1 or 2 places in China, if you've only been to the major cities, I don't think that's a good enough way to kind of describe how China is. Especially if you haven't seen places like Xi'an or Yunnan, where there's a big minority populations. I know in Xi'an there's a big Muslim population, and in Yunnan there's so many different ethnic minorities. So I was actually, when we went traveling in Yunnan, we actually met a group of traveling minorities and we hung out with them for a bit. And it's they're very culturally different from a Han Chinese person. So I think there is a lot of cultural differences in different regions of China. But when Americans think of China, they think of Beijing, or they think of the typical Han Chinese person. And I think, while to an extent that's true, because those are the people that are coming to America and study abroad programs, that's not the full picture of China. As similar to how the US has the northern culture, the southern culture, the West, the LA culture, the New York culture. There's just so many diversity in even the United States, and I could say the same in China. And I think I honestly do recommend people to travel there and just see other places besides like Shanghai and Beijing, because it's very rich culturally.
From infrastructure to food taste to cultural history, and also, you know, thinking back about what they know about that specific area. Like Beijing has Tiananmen Square, they have the Forbidden Temple, they have the Garden of Heaven, or something of heaven. Like they've all these very, very old cultural monuments that are so incredible to their culture as Beijingers, as people from Beijing. And then Shenzhen, 40 years ago, it was a fishing village, or mostly marshland. So all they've really known is how fast they've developed the city, like how well they've done with startup companies, and all that they've created in these last 40 years. Like, it's absolutely incredible what they've done. So they really base their cultural identity on, you know, fast moving technology, economy, startup companies, things like that. And it really reflects in the way that people, I think, go about their daily lives in both these different areas. And I love them both very, very much. I lived in Beijing for over a year and Shenzhen for a year. But the cultural and societal aspects definitely make a huge difference on where you are and how you go about daily and overall life there. I think it's very, very interesting.
So could you use just one sentence to make a prediction of future US-China relations?
I think that future US-China relations will be very good going forward as the political climate starts to ease.
Thank you.
I think that the US-China relations in the future will be rocky. We're going to have to really work together.
I would say, like, I'm not as optimistic about US-China's relations. I would say I kind of feel there might be another kind of Cold War situation that goes on between the two nations. In terms of, like, no physical fighting will happen, but there might be a lot of clash between, like, ideology. And especially especially when it comes to certain issues like human rights, as we talk about, like, there's a lot of news about the Uyghurs in China right now. And also human rights here in the United States, you know, like, a lot. I feel like that's going to be one of the points of contention, is how these two countries talk about human rights moving forward. And also just, like, I think as long as the economy becomes such a focal point that we focus on about China, the two countries are going to continue to fight over, like, resources, especially in Africa, as we see both countries are investing heavily in African countries and African nations.
Yes, and I'm not very optimistic as well as Alice.
Thanks, guys, for just going like 4 or 5 sentences. I tried to put it all in one sentence. Like,
no, we need positive people here. We need positivity.
Okay, I think this is a good time to for me to thank everyone. I don't want this to end. I learned so much from you guys. You know, you all have keen observations and very unique perspectives. I wish more people in the government, from the embassy people, from China, from the US, and State Department, from both sides, they should listen to you. You know, you are our hope.